Hello, I'm Mary Gentile, and I'm delighted and honored to be able to share Giving Voice to Values with you today at the Education Collaborative. I'm so glad that you're able to be together again in person. I wish I was there, but I look forward to the live Q&A after my remarks today. And what I'd like to do is to share with you just a little bit about what Giving Voice to Values is, how it's being used in Africa, and why it works. And I'll share a few stories, and then I'll look forward to talking with you later to see if there are ways that it can be useful in your own work, in your own educational initiatives. So to begin with, I'll say I'm particularly happy to be here with the invitation of Ashesi University. Ashesi University was not only the first educational institution in Africa to use Giving Voice to Values, but it was actually the first undergraduate institution in the world to incorporate Giving Voice to Values into their work. And so I've been delighted to be working with them for over a decade now. I've also worked with other organizations in Africa. I've worked with Unilever in Nigeria. I've worked with the American University of Cairo and the German University of Cairo in North Africa. I've worked with Al Aqwan University in Ifran, Morocco in North Africa. Done work with the University of Cape Town and Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa, and also worked under the auspices of Stellenbosch to develop an educational program for corporate managers that use Giving Voice to Values. So it's particularly exciting for me to begin sharing this with all of you at the collaborative today. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time telling you what Giving Voice to Values is and why it works, why we developed it. To begin with, Giving Voice to Values is a new approach, an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. I created it originally for use in business schools and business ethics programs, but it's actually grown well beyond that. It's being used in business schools, of course, but we're starting to use it in engineering, in healthcare, medicine, and nursing, in law. We're using it with companies, large and small, around the world, with the U.S. military. It's been used in the Australian police force. We've worked with a number of NGOs, and it's literally been shared on all 7 continents, including the Antarctic. So it's really grown beyond its original objectives. But if you don't remember anything else from what I'm going to talk to you about today, I hope you'll remember this. Giving Voice to Values is about asking and answering a new question, a different question when it comes to values and ethics and responsible practice in our businesses, in our educational institutions, and in our wider lives. The typical question we ask and try to answer is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a good question. It's an important question. It's one I'm sure that you do think and talk about. But Giving Voice to Values asks and tries to answer the question, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how can you get it done? How can you get it done effectively, successfully? How can you do it in a way that will move others to come with you along in that process? And how can you get it done in a way that will minimize any damage to your own careers and to the organizations themselves? So Giving Voice to Values is about action. So if you don't remember anything else, remember that. But let me take a step back and tell you a bit about why I created Giving Voice to Values. And I like to tell people that it grew out of my own personal crisis of faith. I'd been working in the field of business ethics and leadership development at leading business schools. I was 10 years at Harvard Business School. I've spent 6 years at Babson College in Boston, which is ranked #1 in the world for entrepreneurship, and now 6 years at the University of Virginia, Darden School of Business. And frankly, I became discouraged. This was back in the mid-90s. I became discouraged with the way that values and ethics and leadership were discussed and taught about in business schools. We tended to approach it as if it was entirely a cognitive problem. We tended to give rules and decision-making frameworks, but we never talked about tools and action and implementation. I call it the preach and pretend method. We'd preach to you about what's right, and then we pretend you could do it. And this became discouraging to me. I began to think that maybe trying to do this was at best futile and at worst kind of hypocritical. I have several reasons why I felt that way. I'll just tell you about a couple of them. I mean, one of them was simply that it seemed every few years there'd be a spate of new scandals that would hit the business press. And if you happened to be working in a business school like I was, we would create a task force, we'd create a committee, and we would take a look at, everything that we're teaching and what the faculty say and the students and our recruiters and the alumni, and we would talk to the folks who actually had worked with our students to understand what they were bringing into the workplace. And I was always on this committee, and we would take a look at the courses we were teaching and the research we were doing, and we would come up with some new ideas, and we'd create a new course, or we'd start a research project, we'd hire some new faculty, and we would send out press releases, and then a few years later the whole cycle would start again. And I had lived through this multiple times, and it began to feel somewhat futile. We were trying, but nothing seemed to be making an impact. But I think the bigger reason why I had my crisis of faith is what I actually saw in the classroom or in organizations when I was doing consulting. And it was this, that whenever we were going to talk about ethics, we would typically give people some sort of thorny ethical dilemma, a case study, and we would ask them to read it before we started our discussion. And people would come into the room with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do was. And then in the course of the conversation, two things would happen. First of all, their thinking would become more complex. They'd begin to think, well, maybe I didn't have all the information, or maybe this is just standard operating procedure, the way they do it in this company, or this industry, or this part of the world. Or maybe it is wrong, but it's really above my pay grade. It's not my responsibility. Or maybe it's wrong, but if I try and do something, I might make it worse, and I'm certainly not likely to be effective. And so, people's thinking would become more complex. They'd begin to think about this in a different way. I actually think that's a good thing. I don't want people to walk into these situations naively. But the second thing that would happen in these conversations was more troubling to me. And it was this. I don't know if you have this experience, but typically when I'm in a classroom or when I'm in a company organizational training session, there's usually a couple people that when they speak, everybody turns to listen to them. Maybe they're the most articulate, the ones who always have a witty story to tell to illustrate their point, right? Or, when I'm in a corporate setting, they're usually the person of the highest rank in the room. I have some funny stories to tell about that. But whatever it is, those people, the ones who everyone listens to, are the ones who typically would be voicing the most skeptical, if not cynical perspectives. They would be the ones who'd be saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world, it's just not possible. So what was happening is that the people everyone listens to are telling them, you can't do this. So what I was afraid of is that people were walking out of these conversations both more confused and less empowered, less enabled. And I began to think, really? Is this the best we can do? This isn't really how I want to spend my time. I want to have an impact. I want to do good things. And so I decided to take a break from this work. I took a step back. Life is short. I wanted to do something that mattered. And this was, as I say, in the late 90s. And around that time, I had a number of experiences that led to the creation of Giving Voice to Values. I think one of the most significant was a consulting assignment that I had at Columbia Business School. And while I was there were a group of faculty who were also working still on these ethics issues in their curriculum, and they asked me to take a look at what they were doing. This was their idea, not mine. And they were asking all of the incoming MBA students at Columbia Business School during orientation to answer one question and to just write a paragraph or so about it. They didn't have to put their names on it. And this was the question. Tell us about a time in your work experience so far when you were explicitly told or implicitly pressured to do something that conflicted with your own values and how you handled it. And so, we gathered hundreds and hundreds of these stories. It's not empirical data, right? It was self-reporting. But they asked me if I'd take a look at them. So I read well over 1,000 of these stories over several years, and they were really interesting. So let me tell you what we learned. The first thing we learned is that if you think about the kinds of people who were getting their MBAs at Columbia, at least at that time, this was the late 90s, Most of them already had a few years of work experience. So the first thing we learned is that I could probably count on one hand the number of them who said, I was never asked to do something that conflicted with my values. They pretty much all had a story to tell. And then the second thing we learned is, again, if you think of the kinds of people who get an MBA at Columbia, certain industries were more heavily represented than others. A lot of people from the financial services industries, a lot of people from the big consulting firms, big pharma, some high tech. So the kinds of stories they told got repetitious really quickly. They talked about being pressured to inflate or deflate their billable hours in a way that didn't really correspond to their work, or being asked to tamper with the equations and the benchmarks they use to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage their clients to take actions that would maximize revenue for their firm. Or being asked to exaggerate the capabilities of a product, a new piece of software, a new pharmaceutical product, beyond what their data showed in order to maximize sales revenues. There were always stories of pressures to engage in various forms of corruption, facilitating payments or bribes in order to gain access to certain markets or to compete in certain RFPs. And then there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues around hiring and firing and fairness and discrimination. So the stories got repetitious really quickly. What was interesting is that their solutions or their responses differed, and they fell into some recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little less than half of them, said, yes, I had this conflict, and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back, but I really didn't think I had any option. So they just did what they were told to do. That was the largest group, a little less than half. And then there was a small group who said, yes, I had this conflict and it bothered me so much I couldn't do it. But I also didn't think I really had any options. And so these people removed themselves from the situation. So they got themselves transferred to a different work group or a different manager. A few of them even quit their jobs, but this was a small group. Now the remainder of the whole group, so now we're talking about a third of them, said, yes, I had this conflict and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of them said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So we thought, well, this is interesting. These are people who, all got into Columbia Business School. They've got some level of abilities. They're talking about the same industries, the same types of issues, sometimes the same companies. And yet some of them were able to do this and effectively, and so many others were not. So it wasn't really empirical data, but we thought it was interesting and maybe it would give us some clues for educational purposes. So we brought in a researcher to kind of slice and dice the stories and look for patterns and themes. And in the end, she couldn't say that one group was more morally troubled than the other group because we let them define their own issues. So it wasn't like I gave them an issue and it mattered more to you than to him or something. We let them choose something that bothered them. And we couldn't say that one group was more politically savvy, organizationally sophisticated than the other, because yes, in fact, some of the people who did this effectively were very clever and came up with ingenious win-wins. But some of them were kind of clumsy and kind of even naive in the way they did it. So that wasn't the difference. So in the end, the only thing we could say is that the people who did this effectively at some point said something outside of their own heads. And it might have started by talking to a friend or a spouse or a partner, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. So when I heard that, I kind of went back to my crisis of faith. I thought, well, what do I do with that? I was looking for some sort of really neat insight, some really clever observation, and I wasn't really sure what to do with this. But then I remembered some research that I had seen years earlier when I was still at Harvard Business School. It was research by two different scholars, Douglas Hunnicky and Perry London. And they both had decided independently that they were going to study people who acted with great conviction in times of really high stakes, and to try and understand who were those people, why did they do this. So they decided to do qualitative research, to do in-depth interviews. And the population that they both decided independently to study were people who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their own lives at stake during the Holocaust to help others. And so they found groups of these people, they did these interviews, they were trying to find out, did they have any common family background, religious background, personal experience, educational experience, what led them to be able to do this when so many others did not. And they did find a set of characteristics, but the only one that really stuck with me was this. They said that the people who did this when so many others did not all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss or a teacher, a mentor, even a parent, they'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then various kinds of moral conflicts. Now, of course, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they'd had this experience at both the cognitive level and the behavioral level. And so at the cognitive level, they had the experience of naming the values that mattered to them and putting words to it, a script, an articulation. And at the behavioral level, they had the experience of voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them, who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to speak with in the actual circumstances. So there was this component of rehearsal, pre-scripting, practice, peer coaching. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So we decided to do a little bit more exploration. We did two kinds of exploration. The first was we just interviewed people. We gathered stories from people at every level in organizations, from people right out of school to C-suite executives. And we asked them that same Columbia question, tell us about times when your own values conflicted with what you felt pressured to do and how you handled it. So we gathered lots of stories. We also had the stories we had already gathered. And then we also looked at the research. So this was about a dozen years ago, and there was starting to be a lot of research, there's even more now, in numerous disciplines that suggested that if you really want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal and pre-scripting and peer coaching are very effective strategies. So in the field of psychology, there had been a lot of research on habit formation. There's also a school of thought in psychology, or a school of research, they call it the study of positive deviance. So they study people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they have a really great phrase. This is their phrase, not mine, but I'll share it because it sort of gets to what I'm talking about. They say if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more impactful to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then there's a lot of research. I'm sure you've seen some of the popularizations of research in the fields of cognitive neurosciences. And they talk about brain plasticity, and they talk about creating new neural pathways. Antonio Damasio does some of this research. But the research I'm going to tell you about is different because I think it's tangible and it'll help you understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to tell you a story about something that comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. So back in the day when I first went to work at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. Now, I had never in my life felt the need to take a self-defense class. I was very fortunate in that way, until I went to work at Harvard Business School. And then I thought, maybe I need this. So I looked around Boston, and there were a lot of these courses, and they all teach pretty much the same thing. Maybe some of you have taken such a course. They teach you the physical moves. So it's fist to bridge of nose, and heel to instep, or knee to groin, and they have you practice these moves in the air. And then the idea is now, if anyone ever attacks me, I know what to do, right? But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model, so they would still teach you all those moves and you'd practice them in the air. But then once you knew the moves, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, if you remember those ads. And they would line us all up, and we would take turns getting attacked by this gentleman, and we could then use these moves on him full force because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But then as the class went on, week after week, I might be talking to someone over here. He would come and grab me. I would never know when. I would never know what move or what hold he was going to use. So it was really nerve-wracking. But they explained to us that this is based on this research from the field of kinesthetics called the study of specific state muscle memory. Those of you who are athletes will be familiar with this. It's the idea that if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that then even if you freeze in that moment, your body remembers. So the tennis pro will practice her serve over and over before she goes to the tournament, so when she gets there under all that pressure, her body just naturally assumes the proper form. So one day I'm in this class and I'm lying on my back because I have failed to protect myself from this gentleman, and I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a kind of default behavior, a default to voice, and not just to speaking up? Because one of the things I was learning from all my interviews is that the people who did this effectively, it was rarely a matter of, blowing the whistle or, shaking their fist and speaking truth to power. It was more often much more tactical, much more nuanced, much more sophisticated. And so I thought, and also I was learning that the kinds of objections, the kinds of resistance that people face are very predictable. There's certain kinds of, we call them reasons and rationalizations, that you hear over and over, and they're powerful, but they're not bulletproof. But they would require some anticipation and pre-thought in order to respond to them. So I thought, could you create a default to informed voice? And so that was sort of the idea behind this. Could we create some sort of experience that would allow people to prescript and action plan and rehearse and coach each other and practice and develop this moral muscle memory, this habit, this informed habit. So then I went back and looked at, well, what do we actually teach? And then I got discouraged again because we tend to present dilemmas, scenarios, and we spend all our time debating what's the right thing to do. And we might give you guidelines, whether it's the law or a company's code of ethics or methods of reasoning from philosophy, utilitarianism or deontology and virtue ethics. And we ask people to figure out, is this over the line or not? Is this okay? And then once they've decided that, you're done. But it doesn't really tell people how to do it when you're facing lots of pressure. The other problem with that approach is that sometimes it can be a kind of schooling for sophistry, because people will practice rationalizing and justifying anything because it's the thing that they think will be easier to do. And so that's really not what we were trying to achieve. So I decided we needed to create a new pedagogical approach, a new curriculum. And so we created what we call the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. It's still case-based or scenario-based, but instead of ending with a main actor, a protagonist who's trying to decide what the right thing to do is, it ends with a protagonist who's already decided what's right. And the question becomes, how could they get it done successfully? What would they need to say and do? What will the pushback be? And then what would they say and do? And are they going to do this alone? Is it a one-on-one conversation? Or do they need to gather a set of allies? Or is this a one-off situation? Or is it really a systemic problem, in the culture or in the organization or in the region? And if it's a systemic issue, you need to develop a systemic approach. So you need to be thinking more incrementally, more long-term, more strategically. So that was what we wanted to do. We wanted to create a curriculum that would help people do that. And so this thought experiment, we talk about these scenarios, they end with the protagonist who's decided what's right, and we engage people in literally creating action plans and scripts and then sharing them and coaching each other on how to make them better. I never ask people, what would you do? Because if I ask someone, what would you do, we know now from the research that our reactions are automatic, kind of unconscious, emotional, that most of the time, not always, but most of the time, we don't sit down and make a pro and con list or think about what would Aristotle say. Instead, we tend to react automatically, and then we justify after the fact, post hoc, why it was the right thing to do, or why it was the only thing we could do. And so we don't ask that question because we don't want to trigger that unconscious, automatic, self-protective response. It's not because people are trying to be evil, it's because they're trying to protect themselves from the cognitive dissonance of knowing something's wrong and doing it anyways. And so our brain protects us from that. So I don't want to trigger that. So instead we ask, what if you were this person who's decided this is what they think is right? How could they be effective? This brings the pressure down. And we know from research that people are more creative, more innovative when they feel less pressure. But it also allows people to imagine how this might happen. I never ask people what they would do until they actually have some options that they believe might be possible. And so we ask this question of what if you were this person, and invite you to create the scripts and the action plan and rehearse together. And the idea here is that we're hopefully rewiring that automatic response so that when you do encounter these situations, you have more imaginative options that are available to you. So we created hundreds of pieces of curriculum, cases and teaching notes and essays, and there's a book series, and there's a MOOC, and there's interactive modules, and much of this stuff is available online for free. And then we just invited people to experiment with it, to begin to work with it. We were struck, I was struck and somewhat shocked at the speed and breadth of its take-up. But I think there's a lot of reasons why people were attracted to it. The people who go to business schools, these are people who are not necessarily attracted to thou shalt nots, to a lot of constraints on action. These are people who want to build enterprises, they want to make money, they want to advance their careers, maybe develop some new products or services. They're motivated in this kind of optimistic and can-do sort of attitude. And when we would teach ethics before, it was only about constraints. And giving voice to values actually frames it as, how could you act? How could you be successful? How could you do what you want to do in a way that's consistent with your values? And so it triggers a different part of their brain, and it's much more appealing in that way to business students and business practitioners. In fact, when we go into companies, they often will see this as real leadership development, because it's really about being able to communicate about something that isn't always easy to communicate about, where the easier path may feel like it means to do something else. And so businesses have been quite attracted to this because of the action orientation and the fact that you're developing skills that go beyond even ethical situations. And so we developed all these materials. We invited people to start using it. As I said at the very beginning of my remarks, it's grown quite widely. Some of the areas where it's getting some new traction lately has been in the field of technology fields, engineering, healthcare, medicine and nursing, and we've even started working with the law schools. So that's been all very, very exciting. But you've probably figured out by now that giving voice to values is really just a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? And I like to tell people that it's based on 3 giving voice to values reframes, 3 GVV flips or reversals. So the 3 giving voice to values flips or reversals are, we've reversed what it is we're talking about when we talk about ethics and values and leadership. We've reversed who it is you think you're talking to, and we've reversed how you have that conversation. So in terms of what it is we're talking about, it used to be, if I talked to someone about ethics, business ethics, they would usually say to me, well, Mary, don't focus on the so-called clear-cut, right, easily determined right or wrong, kind of black and white issues. You should focus on the gray issues, the issues where it's not so clear, where it's a little bit right, a little bit wrong. That's where it's really difficult. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. But I've actually changed my mind. Now, of course, there are a lot of gray issues, a lot of issues where it's challenging to figure out what the right thing to do is. But nevertheless, there are a lot of issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree, that's clearly over the line. It's clearly illegal, it's clearly fraudulent, clearly abusive. Just because most of us might feel that way doesn't mean that we feel we can act on those assumptions or those conclusions. And so I've decided, let's focus on those more clear-cut issues Because if we focus on the gray issues, you never get past the conversation about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. You'll spend your whole discussion debating what's really right. But if you actually get to talking about an issue where most of us can agree this is not the right thing to do, you can actually start to talk about action and scripting and creative ways of influencing the decisions. And so we've really tried to focus on those more clear-cut issues. The interesting thing is, in my conversations with people, I remember sharing this approach with some folks at West Point in the US. These were folks who developed ethics training for the entire US Army, 1.3 million enlisted and civilian employees, and they wanted to look at how they could use the giving voice to values approach in their training. And one of the gentlemen I was speaking with told me that, it used to be when I started doing this work that there were a lot of issues that everybody knew were wrong. And as years go on, more and more people see all the issues as gray. And what we talked about was, some of them are gray, but a lot of times people see an issue as gray because it helps them feel okay about not necessarily doing what they know is right. It's what I was talking about earlier when I talked about the research on ethical decision-making, behavioral ethics, that has proven that we tend to act automatically and then rationalize later why it was okay. And so that's why I really think it's important to focus on these issues that most of us would say, yeah, we really would like to be able to do this. So that's the first flip. We focus on the more clear-cut issues. It's not that it's not important to think and rigorously about the gray issues. It's just that's not where we're focusing for GVV. The second flip is who we think we're talking to. Now, it used to be I'd go into a classroom or a school or a business and they'd say, most of the people here are good people. We just have a few bad apples, and they're the ones this program is for. And, I actually think of our audience differently. This is based on some research by a friend of mine, the late Greg Dees and Peter Crampton, who did research on ethics and negotiations. And so they premised, and I based my work on the idea that the classroom, the organization, is a bell curve. And we premise that at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. These are people who would say, I will do whatever I think will maximize my self-interest, regardless of values. Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are the people who would say, that's my primary motivation. And at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as idealists. These are the people, we would define idealists as people who would say, I will always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my own self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put myself there. We call them pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not the same as saying as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It simply means I think I have a shot. I think I have a chance. Now, if you think of your audience that way, I don't think I have the power to change the opportunists. I think they'll always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I would like them to be more skillful, more competent. But we're really focusing on the pragmatists, and we're saying we want to give you the skills. We want to give you the literal scripts. We want to give you the action plans and the rehearsal, the practice to develop that moral muscle memory. And we want to give you the positive examples through our scenarios, our cases, so that you feel more able to act in the way that you already want to act at your best. We're not trying to change you. We're trying to enable you to act in the way that you already want to act and you're at your best. And so our premise is that if enough of the pragmatists and the idealists become more skillful and confident at this and do this more often, it changes the water that the opportunists are swimming in. So the calculus that they do to determine what's in their own self-interest has got to change, because they can't rely on the same level of silent complicity from everybody else. And so that's how we've flipped who it is we think we're talking to. And then the final flip is how we do all this. And I've already explained that to you. Instead of asking the question, what is the right thing to do, and focusing on that exclusively, we ask, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how could you get that done effectively? And we give you the chance to rehearse and practice, prescript, coach each other, and develop that moral muscle memory. So that's giving voice to values in a nutshell. I'm looking forward to the chance to talk with you all about how it's been used in different educational settings, how it's been used in different companies, different parts of the world. I'd love to answer your questions and also get your suggestions, and hopefully we can talk a bit more about the new initiatives that the Education Collaborative has been developing with GVV and Ashesi University. So thank you very much for this opportunity.